let's take a look at these sentences or these pseudo sentences and try to draw some connections between them. And this calls back to stuff that I've mentioned in previous videos and promised that we would get to, and here we are. So let's look at this first one. Unless Elizabeth joins the club. So this pseudo sentence has a subject, Elizabeth. It has a main verb, joins. But notice it's still not a complete sentence. Unless Elizabeth joins the club, what, right? It's dependent, or it's waiting for additional information. It's waiting for a main sentence to complete the thought. So this is a fragment, as we've seen examples of this before. Recall the although sentence with although Buffy tried to slay the vampire. That was a fragment from the first video in the lecture series. So why is this a fragment? It has to do with this word right here. Notice if I got rid of unless, we would have a perfectly fine sentence. Elizabeth joins the club, period. Fine. You could get rid of the unless, or you could add information here. So unless Elizabeth joins the club, she won't have any friends. So now if we add a comma and then a complete sentence here, she won't have any friends. Here's a subject, here's a verb. We would have a fragment if we didn't do that. So either we get rid of this opening word, or we keep the opening word and we add a sentence. So this opening word is really important, and this is what we call a subordinating conjunction. And we'll get into this in more detail in a second. But these are words that subordinate or make dependent the sentence that they begin on another sentence. So that's why we get this idea of a subordinate and or dependent clause. These are sentences that are subordinate to or dependent on some other main sentence. So either you get rid of the subordinating conjunction and everything is fine, or you add something on. Here's another example. Whenever I visit my grandparents' house. Well, whenever you visit your grandparents' house, what, right? There's no actual completed thought. So we could add something to the end of this. We could say, whenever I visit my grandparents' house, I eat a whole box of cookies. Or you could get rid of the word whenever and you would have a complete sentence. Either are fine grammatically. It would just be depending on what you're trying to say. It's not my fault because the dog ate my homework. We saw a sentence similar to this in the fragments videos. Notice this is a fragment. It's not my fault because the dog ate my homework. They go really nicely together. So in fact, if you wanted to fix this, you get rid of the period and then you just combine them together. But just having the because sentence by itself is not good enough. We'll talk more about where you can place these clauses in a second. Even though my brother stole my robot, but I won't hold it against him. So wait a minute, we've got this dependent clause waiting for a complete sentence, and then yet we connect it with a comma and a conjunction. We're kind of mixing two things here. Either we get rid of the even though and then we keep the sentence as is, right? My brother stole my robot, comma, but I won't hold it against him. That's fine. Or we keep the even though and we get rid of the but. Even though my brother stole my robot, I won't hold it against him. Either would be fine. How about this one? When I spent all night memorizing the members of the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly, therefore I fell asleep during the test and failed anyway. So here we have kind of the same thing as before. We have this when, which is introducing this subordinate clause. But then we have this therefore, and we have kind of either a redundancy or we have just a improper way to put these sentences together. Again, I would just probably get rid of the therefore, or you could just change this to the word because, and I think you would still get rid of the therefore. The point is we don't need the therefore given that the information in the subordinating conjunction kind of tells us how these two sentences relate. That, I fell asleep during the test as a result of the fact that I spent all night memorizing this list. So notice what matters here as well, besides structure, is meaning. You want to make sure that you have clarity and meaning. It's concise, no unnecessary words. So let's fully define a subordinate or dependent clause. It's a clause or a sentence that can't stand by itself without creating a fragment, right? So it depends on or is subordinate to an independent clause. And this right here is a list of some of the most common subordinating conjunctions. If you're a native speaker, you know these. You just have to pay attention to the fact that the sentence isn't complete without more information. If you're a non-native speaker and you're still learning English, you might want to commit these to memory. But these are all words that can be used, among other ways, to start subordinate clauses, dependent clauses. So if you see a sentence starting with this, you have to make sure it's complete, otherwise you've got an issue. So let's look at kind of more examples which illustrate how you put these together. So notice these two right here. Although I pretend otherwise, I love practicing for the SAT, versus I love practicing for the SAT, although I pretend otherwise. These are identical, same exact words. Both have this dependent clause or subordinate clause, depending on this independent clause here. So DC, dependent clause. The difference is the order. Here, the dependent clause comes before the independent. Here, the dependent comes after the independent. When it comes before, you must use a comma to separate them, and only a comma. Notice this isn't a comma splice. Remember, comma splice is when you connect two complete sentences with just a comma, because this is not complete. So a comma is totally fine to connect a dependent and an independent. When the dependent comes after the independent clause, for the purposes of the test that we're taking, you don't use a comma here, though in real life there is some complexity with this. For the purposes of what we're dealing with, we don't use a comma here, so you just connect them all the way through. Have a sentence like this: because the company expanded too quickly, is having cash flow problems. A lot of students think that you can't start a sentence with because, so they would try to change this to get rid of the because. But actually, this sentence is totally fine, totally correct. So what's going on here? You might say, well, previously we saw sentences that started with because that you said were a fragment. Why is this one not? So for example, this one, remember here we just had because the dog ate my homework. The problem wasn't that it started with because in itself. The problem was that there was no sentence that this was dependent on. It was just hanging by itself. Notice here, this dependent clause is attached to the following independent clause. There's no problem, right? There's nothing. Because is no different than the word although. It's no different than the word when. It's no different than the word before or after or once. They're all subordinating conjunctions. They can all be used the same way. They can all start sentences. The only thing you got to watch out for is that you have this independent clause that follows that this can be dependent on. You could rearrange this, right? You could say the company is having cash flow problems because it expanded too quickly. In this case, we wouldn't use a comma. Either one is totally fine. So don't think, oh, it starts with because, so it's a fragment. It might be, but you got to look at the whole structure. In previous video, we talked about coordinating sentences, that we could put sentences together with a comma and a conjunction. So for this one, we said, the Yankees played my high school baseball team, comma, our correction was adding an end we won. That's totally fine way to connect sentences. But another way to connect sentences, instead of just coordinating, is subordinating. When we coordinate, we make our sentences basically be on equal footing, and therefore you need to use a comma and a conjunction, or you could have used as well a semicolon here. Both would have been fine. But you could also subordinate. You can make one sentence subordinate to the other by using one of these subordinating conjunctions. So how could we do that here? The Yankees played my high school baseball team. We won. We could, for example, add when. When the Yankees played my high school baseball team, we won. You could, let's see, are there other things we could do? Once the Yankees played my baseball team, comma, we won. That's a little bit weird. I think when is better. You could use other ones here depending on what you want to say, but the point is you could subordinate by adding a subordinating conjunction to the beginning of one of your phrases or one of your sentences, and that would be no problem. And this would be a legal way for us to connect our sentences. Let's look at an example from test number 1. Because consumers reap the nutritional benefits of Greek yogurt and support those who make and sell it, therefore farmers and businesses should continue finding safe and effective methods of producing the food. So two things going on here. Remember, this starts with because, but that's okay if it's connected to a complete sentence, which it kind of is here, except for the problem that we have this word therefore. This is very similar to the sentence that we looked at here. This because and this therefore are redundant, right? The because shows that cause and effect just in the way that therefore kind of shows cause and effect. So we don't need this at all. We can just eliminate it, and we're happy with just having it, comma, farmers, which we see in choice B, because that's how we connect a subordinate and an independent clause. We just put a comma there. So no need for additional words. We don't need a therefore. We don't want to use a colon after this, because remember, this is not an independent sentence. You can't use a colon after a dependent clause, not legal. C is when we've combined using the dependent clause and the comma and the conjunction. We don't want to do that. If you got rid of the because, you could then, I guess, potentially use the comma and the so, but because we have the because there, we only need a comma. So that's why our best answer here is B.